Sometimes healing doesn't knock on the door. It's left crying on a frozen sidewalk. When a quiet, grieving single father opened his home to a widow and her twin girls freshly cast out after a funeral, he had no idea he was about to be saved in return. This is not just a story about loss. It's a story about the quiet kind of love that arrives like spring after a brutal winter. If stories like this speak to your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more moments that remind us all of what really matters. Now let's begin. The snow fell like whispers that refused to be silenced, blanketing the quiet town of Willow Glen in a soft, relentless white. It was the kind of cold that crept into your bones, without asking, the kind that made the world look peaceful on the outside. Even when your heart was anything but Jonas, Whitaker gripped the steering wheel tighter as he navigated his rusted old pickup down Maplewood Lane. His son Mason sat beside him in the passenger seat, bundled in an oversized coat, staring silently out the window. They had just left the local clinic. Mason's recurring nightmares had returned, and the doctor suggested more time, more patience, maybe even more prayer. Jonas had plenty of the first two, and none left for the third. Then he saw them. At first it was just a blur through the falling snow. A figure, no three, a woman, dark-haired, slender, and two little girls huddled on either side of her, all in black. They stood at the iron gate of a large white mansion, its tall columns and frosted windows, casting a regal but unforgiving presence. Jonas instinctively slowed down. The front door of the house slammed shut behind them, and a sharp voice pierced the air even through the rolled-up windows. "You were never really family. He's gone, and so is your place here." The woman didn't shout back. She didn't cry. She merely bowed her head, wrapped her arms tighter around the twins, and reached for the small, battered suitcase at her feet. One of the girls clutched a faded teddy bear. The other held a wooden box close to her chest, as if it contained something sacred. Snow gathered in their hair on their shoulders, their shoes soaked through from standing too long. Jonas pulled over. Dad Mason's voice was barely above a whisper. "I see them," Jonas said, already. Unbuckling his seatbelt, he stepped out into the cold, each breath hitched in his throat like he'd swallowed ice, "Ma'am." He called gently, careful not to frighten them. The woman turned slowly, her eyes green and hollow, like winter glass met his. She looked too exhausted to be scared, too broken to be proud. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Jonas said. "But it's freezing. You and the girls, do you have somewhere to go?" She looked down at her daughters, then back at him, her lips parted but no words came. One of the twins began to cry, quiet, restrained sobs that hurt more than wails. "I've got a place," Jonas added. "It's nothing fancy, just a fixer-upper farmhouse outside town, but it's warm and safe." The woman hesitated. "I'm Jonas," he said, taking a cautious step forward. "This is Mason." "My boy, Mason," one of the girls echoed, peeking up. Jonas smiled gently. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The woman's voice finally emerged, cracked and soft. "Elise. And these are Hazel and Wren," Jonas nodded. "Elise. I'm not trying to be a hero, just seems wrong. You standing out here with those girls in this weather? Let us help." She didn't move for a long time. Then she gave the slightest nod. Jonas took the suitcase, while Elise carried the wooden box and held Hazel's hand. Wren clung to Elise's coat, shivering but silent. As they walked to the truck, Jonas noticed the carved initials on the box. CM. Whoever he was, he mattered. Back on the road, Mason offered Hazel a granola bar from his coat pocket. She took it with a trembling smile. "Thank you," she whispered. The ride was quiet, but not tense. Jonas could feel the weight in the truck, the invisible kind, the grief, the questions, the fear. He'd carried it too. Still did. They arrived at the farmhouse 20 minutes later. It was old, with peeling paint and a crooked porch swing, but the chimney smoked, and the lights were on. Home didn't have to be perfect, just warm inside. Jonas showed them the spare room, the one he'd been fixing up for no real reason except that maybe deep down he'd hoped someone would need it someday. "There's a bathroom down the hall, towels in the closet," he said. "I'll let you get settled." Elise paused at the doorway. "Why are you doing this?" Jonas met her eyes. "Because someone once did it for me, and because no one should be alone in the cold." She didn't thank him, not with words, but the way she looked at him, that quiet, searching look, was more than enough. He stepped away, leaving her to the silence and the girls. As he walked back down the hall, Mason tugged on his sleeve. "Dad," he said, "are they staying?" Jonas looked over his shoulder toward the room, then down at his son. "For now," he said. "Yeah, for now." Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside that little farmhouse on the edge of Willow Glen, something had shifted. Warmth was returning. The farmhouse creaked with every gust of wind, as if it too had grown old, carrying the weight of winter's past. Jonas sat alone at the kitchen table, a chipped mug of coffee warming his hands. It was just past 6 in the morning, and the snow outside glowed blue under the early light. Silence, once a welcome companion, now felt like a stranger sitting across from him. The room down the hall was quiet. Elise and her girls had arrived less than 12 hours ago, but their presence had already changed the texture of the house. Not in noise or clutter, but in stillness, gentler somehow, like the house was holding its breath. Mason shuffled into the kitchen, hair tousled and eyes puffy with sleep. "Morning," Jonas said softly. Mason yawned. "Are they still here?" "Yeah," Jonas replied. "Still asleep, I think." He didn't say what he was really thinking, that he wasn't sure how long they'd stay. That a woman with twin daughters and a box of ashes probably had more pain than peace to unpack. That maybe letting them in was the start of something neither he nor Mason were ready for. Later that morning, as the sun finally lifted over the frosted hills, Jonas heard footsteps from the hallway, light, uncertain ones. He looked up and saw Hazel peeking into the kitchen, ran a step behind her, both clutching identical stuffed bears. "Good morning," Jonas said gently. They blinked at him. Hazel nudged her sister, who took a tiny step forward. "Is there breakfast?" Wren asked. Jonas smiled. "There will be in about 10 minutes. He motioned to the table. The girls sat carefully, as if afraid the chairs might break beneath them. Mason, watching from the living room, wandered over and offered them both a half-smile before grabbing bowls for cereal. Moments later, Elise appeared at the doorway. She was wearing the same clothes as the night before, her hair loosely pulled back, dark circles shadowing her eyes. There was a grace to her, quiet and dignified, like someone who had learned to survive without asking for much. "You don't have to cook," she said softly. "I do when there are kids in the house," Jonas replied, cracking eggs into a pan. She hovered at the door, uncertain whether to stay or go. "The girls are fine." Jonas added, "Really, they're welcome here." Elise nodded, lips pressing together, like she wasn't sure whether to thank him or apologize. Instead, she murmured, "Is it okay if we stay a couple more nights? I just need time to think." "You've got it," Jonas said without hesitation. That night, after the girls had gone to bed and Mason had retreated to his room, Jonas stepped into the hallway to check on the thermostat. He paused outside the spare room. Through the thin wooden wall, he heard Elise's voice, a soft, melodic hum. She was singing something slow and tender, perhaps a lullaby from long ago. Jonas leaned against the wall, letting the warmth of the moment seep through him. It had been a long time since anyone had sung under his roof. The next morning, Jonas found a note on the kitchen counter in neat, slanted handwriting. "Thank you for the warmth." He tucked it into his pocket without thinking. Over the next few days, the rhythm of the house shifted gently. Jonas still rose early, made breakfast, and worked on repairs. Elise began tidying up without being asked, folding laundry, washing dishes, sweeping the porch, even as the snow returned. The girls played quietly sometimes, with Mason, sometimes by themselves. No one talked much about the past. It lingered in the corners, but didn't demand attention. And then came the paper cranes. Jonas found one on the windowsill one evening, delicate, folded from an old newspaper. Then another on the mantel, a third tucked beside the sugar jar. Each one different but unmistakably from Elise's hands. He left a note beside the fourth. "Do they mean something?" Her reply was simple. Hope. One night, Jonas worked late fixing the water heater in the basement. When he finally came upstairs, exhausted and damp, he found a plate of warm cornbread on the table and a note beside it. "Thought you might be hungry." He sat down alone in the dim light of the kitchen and ate every bite. In the silence, he realized something profound. He didn't miss the quiet anymore. Not like before. Because now the quiet had layers. It held songs and whispers and the shuffle of little feet. It held signs of life. Later that night, Jonas passed by the spare room. From the other side of the wall came a soft thud, followed by a low exhale. Elise, perhaps dreaming, perhaps restless. He lifted his hand and laid it flat against the wood. "I don't know what brought you here," he whispered, "but I think maybe it was meant to be." On the other side, unseen, Elise sat up in bed staring at the wall. She hadn't heard the words, not clearly, but somehow she felt them, and for the first time since the funeral, she smiled. The first real thaw didn't come from the sky. It came in the form of a teacup, chipped and mismatched, left on the kitchen table one morning, with a folded napkin beneath it. On the napkin, in Elise's careful script, were the words, "For your mornings. Thank you for letting us stay." Jonas stared at it longer than he meant to. It wasn't the cup that caught him, nor the tea, just a plain blend, still warm. It was the gesture, the kind that said, "I see you," without making a sound, and somehow it lingered longer than any words ever could. He washed the cup, dried it, and placed it back on the shelf. Then he left behind a small, sharpened pencil and a notepad outside Elise's door. "For your thoughts, if you feel like writing instead of speaking." By noon, the notepad had disappeared. The house began to shift in small but meaningful ways. Elise started baking in the early afternoons, quietly, as if she didn't want to assume. But the scent of cinnamon and cloves crept through every room. The girls colored pictures at the kitchen table, their markers and crayons always neatly returned. Mason began leaving his bedroom door slightly ajar at night. The paper cranes continued to multiply. Jonas found one perched on his toolbox. One day, after returning from an errand in town, he opened the front door and paused. Elise was on her knees in the entryway, scrubbing the old wooden floorboards with lemon oil and an old rag. She looked up, startled. Not embarrassed, just unsure of his reaction. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she replied quietly. "But I wanted to. This house has taken us in. It deserves some care." "Back." Jonas nodded. It was a simple answer, but something in it caught him by the chest and held him there. Ruby Delaney, the town's beloved bakery owner and unofficial keeper of everyone's business, stopped Jonas at the grocery store later that week. "Heard you've got company," she said, dropping 2 bags of flour into his cart. Jonas didn't flinch. "I do." Ruby raised a knowing brow. 3 ladies under your roof, and you haven't lost your mind. They're not a burden." "Ruby, I never said they were. Just said, "You haven't lost your mind." Yet, she winked, but her tone softened. They seem like good people. Especially that woman. "Elise, is it?" Jonas nodded. Ruby's voice dropped as she added, "She carries grief, like someone who's learned to walk with it." That night, Jonas sat by the fireplace after the children had gone to bed. The house was still except for the crackle of burning logs and the wind brushing against the old window panes. On the coffee table sat a plate, 3 molasses cookies, and a note. For after a long day, he didn't eat them right away. He stared at the note like it might say something else if he read it twice. Then finally he took a bite. They were warm even hours later. A week passed. Elise began joining Jonas in the kitchen while he made breakfast. Not every day. Not for long, but enough that the silence between them started to feel more like comfort than distance. "You fix things for a living?" she asked one morning, watching him tinker with a broken toaster. "Used to now. I just fix what I can around here. Keeps my hands busy. Did your wife like that?" He paused, not in pain, but in memory. She used to say, "I fix things better than I fixed myself." Elise didn't apologize for the question. She just nodded, understanding that some truths didn't need patching. It was Hazel who brought the next shift. She handed Jonas a drawing one evening, a house with a red roof, smoke curling from the chimney stick figures in front. Jonas, Mason, Elise, Hazel, and Wren. 5 names all spelled in shaky block letters. "You drew this?" Jonas asked. Hazel nodded. "It's our house now, right?" Jonas looked to Elise. She looked stunned, like someone had opened a door she hadn't realized was closed. "I guess it is," Jonas said. Voice low. "If you want it to be." Elise didn't speak, but her eyes were glassy. And when she helped tuck Hazel and Wren into bed that night, she lingered at the doorway longer than usual, watching Jonas as he said goodnight to Mason. That same evening, Jonas found another note waiting on the notepad outside his door. "I've spent a long time surviving. Thank you for letting me begin living again." He traced the handwriting with his thumb, then sat at the kitchen table, candlelight flickering across his weathered face, and wrote something back. "You've brought more life into this house than I have in years. You're not just staying, Elise. You're rebuilding." He folded the note and slipped it under her door. She found it before sunrise. And when she read it, hand-trembling breath caught something inside her, began to stitch itself back together. Not all at once, but one gentle thread at a time. The cold had settled in for good. Willow Glen's narrow roads shimmered with frost each morning, and the trees wore their coats of snow like elders in solemn white. But inside Jonas's farmhouse, something had thawed. Not just the pipes or the air near the stove, but something more difficult to define. Something human. That Saturday morning, Jonas found Mason at the table cutting squares of colored paper with a careful hand. Hazel and Wren watched from across the table, their eyes wide with quiet wonder. "What are you making?" Jonas asked, pouring himself a second cup of coffee. Mason didn't look up. Jonas raised a brow. "Paper cranes." Mason nodded. "Hazel showed me," she said. "Her mom used to make them when she was sad." Jonas glanced over to the twins. Hazel nodded solemnly. "She says, every crane is a wish." Wren added her voice barely louder than the ticking clock on the wall. Jonas smiled, then reached for a sheet of paper himself. "Then I suppose I ought to make one too." By mid-morning, the kitchen window was lined with 10 cranes, all different colors. Blue, red, pale yellow. Even one made from a receipt. Elise watched from the hallway, arms crossed, eyes soft, with something close to gratitude. She didn't interrupt, didn't speak, she just let it happen. After lunch, Elise stepped into the living room, where Jonas was working on repairing the leg of an old armchair. She held out a pair of gloves. "Would you mind taking the girls and Mason out for a bit? There's something I'd like to do in the kitchen, and I work better alone." Jonas blinked. "You sure?" She smiled. "Positive. The sun's out. The pond might be frozen." "All right," he said, setting down his tools. "Bundle up, kids. We're heading outside." It had snowed the night before, but the sun was bright and the wind had paused its biting. The walk to the frozen pond took 10 minutes past trees, heavy with snow, and fence posts that looked like ghostly sentinels. The children ran ahead, their laughter echoing through the stillness. At the pond's edge, Jonas tested the ice with his boot. It held. Hazel was the first to step on, sliding cautiously, arms outstretched. Mason followed, more confident. "I've done this before," he said. Wren stood back, holding Jonas's hand. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "It's just cold." He knelt beside her. "It is, but see how your sister is doing it. You don't have to rush." She didn't speak, but after a few seconds, she took a step forward. Then another. Jonas stayed close, not touching, but never more than a breath away. They spent an hour on the ice. Mason found a stick and started drawing shapes in the snow. Hazel and Wren took turns, spinning, slowly, falling and giggling and brushing themselves off. Jonas hadn't heard so much laughter in years. Later, they sat on a fallen log eating the peanut butter sandwiches Elise had packed. Mason talked about a hawk he once saw flying over the river. Hazel shared that Wren used to sing in church with their father. Wren didn't correct her. Jonas looked up at the bare trees, their limbs black against the pale sky, and felt something open inside him. Not like a wound, more like a window. For the first time in years, he wanted the moment to last. Not just for Mason or the girls, but for himself. When they returned to the farmhouse, the smell hit them. First, warm bread, honey cloves, and something that reminded Jonas of Christmas. Inside, the kitchen had transformed. Elise had cleaned the cupboards, rearranged the shelves, and baked 4 loaves of bread that sat cooling beside a steaming pot of stew. On the table was a card made from folded craft paper. Jonas opened it. Inside, in Elise's now familiar handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for the pond," and the laughter. It sounded like home. He looked up at her. She had flour on her cheek and a worn apron tied at her waist. She met his eyes without flinching. "Dinner in 10, she said. "Smells like a miracle," he replied. That night, after the kids were asleep, Jonas lingered by the fireplace. Elise joined him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. They didn't speak for a while. The flames crackled. Outside, the wind had returned. "I was angry for a long time," Elise said bitterly. Jonas turned, slightly listening, not just at them, at myself, for marrying into a family that only tolerated me, for not standing up more, for not having a plan the day they shut the door. Jonas didn't offer platitudes. He waited. Elise pulled her knees up under the blanket. But then, you showed up, a stranger. No questions, no judgment, just room. And now my girls laugh again. I sleep through the night, and I've made more bread in this house than I did in 5 years of marriage. Jonas chuckled softly. Elise looked at him. You didn't just take us in. You made it safe to hope again. Jonas met her gaze. I don't know what I expected, Elise, but I didn't expect you. They sat a while longer in silence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because some things were better. Left felt. As Elise stood to go, she paused. There's a 5th loaf cooling in the pantry. I thought you might want to give it to Ruby. Jonas raised a brow. You're braver than I thought. She already knows, Elise said, smiling. She's just waiting for you to say it out loud. Later that night, before he turned in, Jonas placed a new crane on the windowsill, this one made from the paper bag. The bread came in. On its wing, he wrote one word: stay. The next few days were quieter, not with distance, but with comfort. Jonas had always believed silence could be heavy, an echo chamber of grief and unfinished thoughts. But now silence lived in his home, like an old friend. It wrapped itself around early mornings and late nights around breakfast, hums and slow shared chores. It let the children giggle in the hallway and gave Elise space to breathe. He didn't know exactly when it had happened, but her presence no longer felt like a temporary storm. It felt like weather that had come to stay steady, inevitable, quietly nourishing. That Friday evening, Jonas found himself at the hardware store picking up screws and a new doorknob for the cellar. When he returned home, the house was dimly lit with a soft golden glow coming from the kitchen. He stepped inside to find Elise seated at the table with Hazel and Wren, each of them folding new paper cranes. The girls giggled as Wren tried and failed to make wings that matched. Jonas smiled. "We're going to run out of flat surfaces soon. We'll build a nest," Elise replied without looking up. There was something in her voice, calm, confident. It made Jonas pause. Not the words, but the ease with which she said them, like she believed she belonged here now. He stepped into the pantry to store his supplies and found a small note taped to the inside of the door. In Elise's handwriting it read, "This house feels alive again." So do I. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Jonas sat at the table flipping through an old repair manual just to keep his hands moving. The wind picked up outside, tapping against the windows, like a reminder that the world beyond was still cold and unpredictable. And then he heard it. Through the thin wall that separated the guest room from the hallway came a soft, broken sob. He froze. It wasn't the kind of cry that begged for attention. It was the kind meant for no one, meant to escape a body that had tried too long to hold it all in. Jonas stood unsure of what to do. He wanted to respect her space, but something deeper, something human urged him forward. He stepped closer to the wall and placed his hand gently against the wood, not to knock, but to anchor himself. "Elise," he said softly, not sure if she could hear. "You don't have to be quiet in this house." The crying stopped. Jonas waited. A minute passed, then another. Then faintly her voice came fragile but clear through the old timber. "I thought I was done crying." Jonas leaned his head against the wall. "Me too, turns out. Grief doesn't follow a calendar." On the other side, Elise sat curled on the bed, her arms wrapped around her knees. She stared at the wall, as if she could see through it, as if she wanted to. "I keep hearing him," she said, her voice trembling, in the girls' laughter, in the hallway, in the way Wren holds her spoon. "And it scares me, how much I miss him, and how much I don't want to go back to who I was when I was with him." Jonas closed his eyes. He understood more than he could say. "You're not that woman anymore," he replied. "You don't have to be." A long silence followed. "Then neither are you." Jonas, the man who lost everything. He opened his eyes. "No," he whispered, "I'm not." The next morning, Elise didn't mention the conversation. She made pancakes with cinnamon and orange zest, the way Jonas's mother used to. He didn't ask how she knew. Some things didn't need explaining. Mason helped Wren with her math workbook, while Hazel braided Elise's hair in crooked but loving loops. It was a Saturday that felt like it had been pulled from someone else's life, a good life, not perfect, but warm. After lunch, Elise approached Jonas by the porch. "Can I ask you something?" He set down the old fence post he was sanding. "Sure." "When your wife passed, how did you start again?" Jonas didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the snow-covered fields, the fence line, the line of trees beyond that, whispered. When the wind passed, I didn't, he finally said. Not really. I just survived for a long time. Got up, fed, Mason worked. There were days I didn't speak to anyone nights. I couldn't sleep without hearing her voice, but eventually the silence stopped hurting. Then it started helping. And then, he glanced back toward the house. Then you and the girls showed up. Elise didn't cry. She just nodded, her expression soft and unreadable. Then she said, I'd like to paint the girls' room, if that's all right. Jonas blinked. Of course it is. She smiled. Wren wants lavender. Hazel wants stars. I think we can manage both. That night, as Jonas was locking up, he noticed something new on the wall above the kitchen doorway. Elise had tacked up a paper banner, hand-cut from old grocery bags. The letters were simple, crooked but clear. This house has room for healing. Below it, she'd placed 5 paper cranes in a perfect row. Jonas stood there for a long time, longer than he meant to. Then he turned out the light and whispered, Amen. The storm arrived without warning. Sunday morning had been calm. Sunlight stretched lazily across the snowbanks, and Jonas had even gone outside without his coat to fetch kindling. The farmhouse smelled of maple syrup and baked oats. Wren had insisted on setting the table with folded napkins, and Hazel had drawn a crayoned sun on the grocery list posted to the fridge. It was the kind of quiet joy that settled into bones. Then came the knock, firm measured, too deliberate to belong to a neighbor too cold to carry kindness. Jonas opened the door and instantly felt the shift in air pressure. On the porch stood a woman in a black wool coat. Her silver hair swept into a severe twist. Her gloved hand held a structured leather purse. Her lips, painted a dark plum, were set in a line honed over decades of disapproval. Margaret Jonas said, Mr. Whitaker. She returned evenly. I believe you're harboring someone who belongs to me. Elise appeared behind Jonas in the kitchen doorway, holding a plate of warm toast. Her face went pale. The toast dropped silently to the floor. Margaret's eyes sharpened. Elise, I see widowhood hasn't dulled your talent for clinging to men who mistake pity for principle. Jonas stepped in front of Elise instinctively. That's enough. I came for what's mine. Margaret continued, my son's remains. That urn belongs to me. And frankly, so did the house she fled from. Elise didn't move. Jonas could feel her trembling behind him. She didn't flee, he said. She was thrown out after burying her husband. In the snow, Margaret's nostrils flared. That was a family matter. Jonas squared his shoulders. This is a home matter now, and you're not welcome here if you come to wound. The tension sat heavy in the living room, thick as chimney soot. Elise stood near the fireplace, arms wrapped tightly around herself. The girls had been ushered upstairs by Mason, who understood better than most how to disappear. When adults raised their voices, Margaret took the only seat offered and waited, glancing around the room like she was tallying imperfections. I want the ashes, she said. No, Elise replied softly. Margaret's head snapped up. I beg your pardon. They're not yours, Elise said a little louder this time. You never visited him in the hospital. You called hospice a waste of money. You didn't come to the funeral until the service had already begun. And you didn't cry. Margaret's face didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered. I held his hand when he died, Elise continued. He asked me to scatter his ashes by the pond in Rock Ridge, not on a mantle, not in your museum of a house. That pond is on private land. I've already written the owner. Elise said, producing a letter from the shelf. She gave her blessings and looked at her. Surprised, Elise met his gaze and gave a faint nod. She had been planning for this, bracing for it. Margaret stood. You always were calculating. I had to be. Elise said, "You raised a man who never once said no to you. Someone had to." The room went still. Margaret gathered her purse. "This isn't over." "I think it is," Jonas said quietly. "For your sake, I hope it is." After Margaret left, Elise sat in the rocker and stared into the fire. Her hands were clenched in her lap, red from gripping the letter too tightly. "You okay?" Jonas asked. She didn't answer at first. Then I thought I'd be scared, but I wasn't. "Not really," Jonas crouched beside her. "Because you're not that version of yourself anymore." She nodded, then whispered. "I didn't even flinch." "You didn't." Elise smiled faintly, but it faded quickly. But the girls heard some of it. I hate that Jonas leaned back on his heels. "You also showed them what it means to stand your ground. That matters." From the stairwell, a soft voice echoed. Mommy Wren stood there clutching her bare eyes wide. Jonas moved aside as Elise stood and crossed the room, pulling her daughter into her arms. "Everything okay?" Hazel's voice followed from above. Jonas answered gently, "Everything's better than okay." The next day, Ruby Delaney dropped by unannounced with a basket of scones and a knowing look in her eyes. I hear ice queens melt too. "If you leave 'em near real warmth long enough," she said. Without preamble, Jonas let out a dry laugh. "You've been talking to someone." "I've been talking to everyone," she replied, handing over the basket. "Town's rooting for that woman, whether she knows it or not." Ruby glanced toward the back of the house where Elise was painting stars on the wall with Hazel. "She ever paint anything for herself?" Jonas hesitated. "Not yet." Ruby nodded. "Once. She will." That night, Jonas found Elise in the living room folding laundry. The girls were asleep, and the house was wrapped in one of those rare silences that came only after a day of emotional weight had lifted. He sat beside her, helping quietly. After a few minutes, he asked, "Do you want me to go with you to Rockridge?" She folded a towel and looked at him. "Would you?" "Of course I thought I needed to do it alone," she said. "But I don't want to anymore." He looked at her, and she looked back. And something passed between them, not a confession. Not yet, but an agreement, a shared understanding. They had both lost, but they were no longer lost. It started with a batch of gingerbread. Elise had never baked it before. Not really. But one snowy Tuesday morning she woke before the children and found herself searching Jonas's pantry for molasses and cinnamon. The kitchen was quiet, the sky outside still half asleep. She tied her hair up, slipped on Mason's old apron, and began to measure, mix, and remember. The scent filled the house before sunrise, warm and familiar, like childhood memories hidden in flour and spice. Jonas entered the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his flannel shirt half-buttoned. "That smells like something you've made 100 times," he said, surprised. "It smells like something I wish I had." Elise answered, placing dough on the tray. He poured himself coffee. "You keep surprising me." She glanced at him, something soft, flickering in her eyes. "I'm surprising myself." Later that day, as the girls napped and Mason read by the fire, Jonas worked in the garage on a broken cabinet door. Elise stepped in, rubbing her arms against the cold. She held 2 mugs of hot cocoa. "I figured if I was going to hijack your kitchen, I might as well bring you tribute," she said, handing him a mug. Jonas took it, grateful for the warmth. "You've done more than hijack it. You've made it breathe again." She leaned against the workbench. "I used to be afraid of silence. Now I like it." He looked at her over the rim of his mug. "Because now it feels like peace, not punishment." Elise nodded slowly. Exactly. They stood quietly for a moment. the sound of wind brushing against the old garage door. Then almost timidly she asked, "Do you ever think about repainting this place?" Jonas raised an eyebrow. "You mean the house?" She laughed. "Yes, the house. The color out front is, well, let's call it honest." He chuckled. "Honest is a polite way to say ugly." "I didn't say that, but you thought it." She shrugged with a smile. Maybe something loosened in Jonas's chest. Not laughter, though that helped, but her. The way she was opening like a door slowly unlatched. He hadn't expected it. Not from her, not so soon. But he wasn't going to rush it either. "Pick a color," he said. "I'll paint it." That evening, Elise didn't retreat to her room after dinner. She stayed at the table, helping Mason and the girls cut paper stars. Hazel insisted on glitter. Wren demanded silver pens. Jonas watched Elise as she gently negotiated with both girls, smiling without effort. When the children went to bed, Elise lingered in the kitchen, wiping crumbs from the table. "You don't have to do that," Jonas said, drying the dishes beside her. "I know," she wiped another corner. I feel better when I'm part of the rhythm." He turned to her. She looked up. Jonas didn't answer with words. Instead, he stepped aside and reached for the drawer near the pantry. Inside was the folded crane she had made for him, the one labeled "Stay." He unfolded it slowly and handed it to her. "I read it every night," he said. Elise's fingers trembled slightly as she held the paper. "I wanted to," she whispered, "but I didn't think I could." "You can." The moment hovered between them, quiet and fragile. Then Elise did something unexpected. She crossed the space between them and rested her forehead against his chest. Jonas froze just for a heartbeat. Then he wrapped his arms around her. Not tightly. Just enough. The world outside was still covered in snow, but inside spring had taken root. The next morning, Elise opened the door to the girls' room and found Mason already there, helping Hazel sort her crayons by shade. Wren was sketching a night sky, with careful strokes, her small fingers smudged with charcoal. "You're all up early," Elise said. Mason grinned. "Hazel says we're designing constellations." Wren held up her drawing. "This one is ours." The image showed 5 stars connected by arcs, like a family portrait written in light. Elise's throat tightened. She knelt down beside them. "I think it's beautiful." Hazel looked at her. "Can we paint it on the wall?" Elise hesitated. "You want to paint it?" "Together," Wren added. Elise smiled, then nodded. "Let's do it." Later that day, Jonas returned from town with a bag of brushes, a gallon of lavender paint, and silver stencils shaped like stars. When he stepped into the room and saw the girls dancing barefoot on a tarp Elise had laid out, he laughed. "I hope you realize what you've started," he said. She handed him a brush, a constellation. He joined them, dipping his brush in lavender. Hours passed. The sun dipped behind the trees, and when the wall dried, it bore the story of 5 souls who had weathered enough darkness to earn their stars. That night, Elise opened the door to her room. Then for the first time, she didn't close it behind her. Snow fell again that morning, soft quiet, like the sky had decided to breathe peace back into Willow Glen. The children were the first to notice their faces, pressed to the frosted window pane, breath fogging the glass as flakes drifted lazily to the earth. "Can we go out?" "Mom," Hazel asked, eyes wide. Wren was already tugging on her boots. Elise stood behind them, one hand on her coffee mug, the other gently stroking Hazel's hair. She glanced out at the blanket of white and nodded, but scarves, gloves, and 2 layers. No negotiations. Jonas, sitting at the kitchen table fixing the strap on Mason's snowshoes, looked up with a smile. "I'll join them." Elise's eyebrows arched. "You out in the cold voluntarily?" He grinned. "There's a first time for everything." They bundled up, stepped outside, and were swallowed by a world softened by snow. The sky hung low and gray, but the ground sparkled in places like someone had spilled sugar across the fields. Laughter echoed off the tree line. The children made snowballs, built lopsided forts, and chased one another with mittened hands. At one point, Wren fell backward into a drift and began sweeping her arms up and down. "What's she doing?" Jonas asked, standing beside Elise. Elise watched with a quiet smile. A snow angel, Hazel, followed, flopping beside her sister. Mason hesitated, then lay down on the other side. From above it looked like 3 wings stretching in a broken circle. "They've never done this before," Elise said. Jonas glanced sideways. "You mean this winter?" She shook her head slowly. Ever, as the children played, Jonas and Elise walked a few paces away, their boots crunching softly over the powder. She stopped beside an old fence post, her breath rising in delicate puffs. "I keep expecting it to disappear," she said. "The snow," she smiled faintly. "No, all of this. The quiet. The warmth. The way the girls laugh now. It feels too whole. Like it can't be real." Jonas said nothing for a moment. Then he reached down and packed snow into a rough ball. He held it up, then lobbed it gently toward her. It landed at her feet. She blinked. "Did you just—" "I did," he said. Elise bent down, scooped snow into her hands, and returned fire this time, square to his shoulder. For the next minute they became children, the kind who forgot about grief and mortgages and lawsuits and scars, the kind who just played because joy doesn't always ask for permission. Back inside, with cheeks flushed and fingers tingling, the 5 of them peeled off layers of damp clothes and crowded near the fireplace. Elise passed out mugs of cider. Jonas passed out dry socks. Hazel curled up beside Mason, and Wren lay her head in Elise's lap. The room was quiet, full of that particular kind of silence that only comes after good noise. Contentment's echo. Jonas looked across the room and caught Elise watching him. What he asked, smiling. She shook her head. "Nothing. Just, this is the first time I've felt like I'm not just surviving winter, I'm living in it." He nodded, understanding more than she knew. That evening, as the snow continued to fall in thick, lazy spirals, Jonas pulled a weathered box from the back of the hallway closet. Elise was cleaning up dinner, and the kids were helping Mason build a domino city. He set the box on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were photos, some bent, others still crisp. A wedding picture, a baby blanket, a pressed flower, and at the bottom, folded with care, a letter. Jonas held it in his hand for a long time before Elise appeared at his side. "Old memories?" she asked gently. "Some of the only ones I've got," he replied. Elise sat down across from him. "You don't have to show me, I want to." He handed her the photo of his wife, bright-eyed, dark-haired, laughing beside a picnic table in the spring. "She was beautiful," Elise said. "She was light," Jonas said. "The kind that doesn't blind you, just finds you in the dark." He unfolded the letter and read aloud the first few lines. It was something his wife had written to Mason on his first birthday, about love, about courage, about choosing kindness, even when life wasn't fair. When he finished, the room was still. Elise reached across the table and took his hand. "You loved her well." He nodded, eyes glassy. "And I let that love die with her for a long time. But now," he looked up at her, "now, I don't think love ends. I think it waits and finds new places to live." Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, Elise stood in the hallway outside her door. Jonas was locking up, turning off lights, doing all the little things that made a house safe for sleeping. She waited. When he approached, she didn't speak. She reached out and gently took his hand. And this time, it wasn't a question. It was a promise. The next morning arrived with a quiet clarity, the kind that settled in after a snowfall, when everything felt possible again. The sun, pale and shy, peeked over the horizon and lit the farmhouse in gentle gold. Inside it was Sunday. Silent. No rush, no demands. Just warmth. Jonas awoke to the smell of cinnamon and cedar. He found Mason already up, helping Wren and Hazel sort through a pile of mismatched buttons for a craft project Elise had started. The radio hummed softly in the background, an old tune, half forgotten, but familiar, playing just above a whisper. When Jonas stepped into the kitchen, Elise looked up from the stove. Her cheeks were flushed from the heat, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. She wore one of Jonas's old denim shirts over her dress, like it belonged to her. Now. Morning, she said, her voice light but settled. Morning. Jonas replied and poured himself coffee. They didn't need more words than that. Not anymore. After breakfast, Elise opened the door to the spare room, the one she had first stepped into with shaking hands and twin daughters at her heels. For a moment, she just stood there, taking it all in. The faded wallpaper, the curtains she'd ironed, the hooks where she'd hung the girls' coats. The room had once felt like a lifeboat. Now it felt too small. Jonas appeared in the hallway. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" She smiled. "I was wondering how you felt about renovations." He leaned against the doorframe. "I feel like we should tear this wall down. Today." Why not within the hour? Mason and the girls had been assigned the noble task of supervising, while Jonas returned from the barn with tools. Elise rolled up her sleeves, grabbed the measuring tape. Va laughed when she realized it had probably been purchased before Hazel and Wren were born. Together they began. The wall came down in pieces, carefully, almost reverently. Behind each layer of drywall and splintered plank was dust wire and memory. Jonas showed Hazel how to remove nails without damaging the wood. Wren helped sweep up. Mason carried out boards with a seriousness that made Jonas proud. By late afternoon, the room had opened up into the adjacent hallway. More light poured in. Elise stood in the doorway, running her fingers along the frame. "It feels honest," she said. Jonas nodded, like it was always supposed to be part of something bigger. They stared at the new, unbroken space, 2 rooms becoming one. The metaphor wasn't lost on either of them. That evening, Jonas brought out an old bookshelf from storage. He sanded it in the kitchen, while Elise painted the walls a soft linen color. The children danced around them, sticky with popcorn and imagination. Hazel turned a cardboard box into a spaceship. Wren glued buttons into a heart shape and placed it above the new doorframe. Elise stepped back and looked at the room. Now, one larger, brighter space. "It's not just a guest room anymore," she said. Jonas put down the brush. "It's part of the home." They stood there together, neither one rushing to leave. That night, Elise tucked Hazel and Wren into their new bed, once Jonas's old frame, now polished and covered with a hand-stitched quilt. Ruby Delaney had dropped off just because Wren reached for her mother's hand. "Are we staying forever?" Elise hesitated, then brushed a lock of hair from her daughter's brow. "As long as this house keeps loving us back," Hazel whispered. "It already does." In the quiet afterward, Elise walked down the hallway. Jonas was in the living room finishing a letter to a friend of his late wife's, an overdue gesture, but one he'd finally found the heart to make. When he saw Elise, he folded the page and smiled. "It's done," she nodded. "So is the room." Jonas looked toward the new opening. "You know, for the first time since I bought this place, it feels like the house is breathing." Elise walked over, sat beside him and took his hand. "It's more than the house." He looked at her. I know. Then quietly she added, I'd like to keep my door open, permanently. Jonas's eyes softened. I was hoping you would. Later that night, as the fire crackled low, Jonas found a folded paper crane on his pillow. It was made from fresh parchment, neatly creased, resting on top of his quilt. He opened it carefully. Inside, in Elise's hand, were just 4 words. We're already a family. Jonas closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he let himself believe it. The snow began to melt by midweek. Tiny rivulets ran down the farmhouse windows, and the porch dripped steadily, leaving damp freckles on the old planks. Winter was loosening its grip. With it, something in Jonas's chest also began to thaw completely. Something he hadn't realized was still frozen. The house was busier than ever. Mason helped Wren construct a telescope from toilet paper rolls and yarn. Hazel painted a mural of daisies on the side of a cabinet, her brushstrokes confident. Elise moved through the home with an ease that made it hard to remember a time she hadn't belonged there. And yet, one silence remained. It came at night just before bed, when Mason would linger in the hallway, peeking into Jonas's room, but never stepping inside. He'd smile, offer a quiet, "Good night, Dad," and retreat. Jonas didn't press, but he noticed one night after dinner and a shared game of dominoes that ended in wild laughter and spilled hot cocoa, Elise stepped outside to watch the stars. Jonas joined her, holding 2 mugs of peppermint tea. Feels like a different season, she said, pulling the shawl tighter around her. Feels like a different life, Jonas replied. They sipped in silence, their breath curling upward with the steam. Then Elise turned to him. Mason. Still wakes up. Sometimes, doesn't he? Jonas nodded. I hear him, but he won't talk about it. Does he know? He can. I've told him, but does he believe it? Jonas sighed. I don't know. Elise tilted her head. Do you want him to? Of course. Then maybe you need to say it differently. The next afternoon, Elise invited Mason to help her bake. It was a simple task. Lemon scones, but she gave him the lead. Measured with him. Laughed when flour dusted her nose. Let him read the recipe out loud in his own halting rhythm. Later, as the scones baked and the girls napped, Elise sat with him on the steps. My dad never talked about feelings. She said he fixed things. Like Jonas. But he didn't fix people. Not even himself. Mason looked at her curious. I remember once I cried in the garage because a kid at school made fun of my freckles. She continued. He handed me a pair of pliers and said, fix something. It'll help. Did it? No, she smiled, but I thought it did. For a while. Then one day, I realized what I needed wasn't to fix something. It was to be heard. Mason didn't reply right away. Then sometimes I miss Mom so much, I forget what she smelled like. Elise reached over and took his hand. Tell your dad that. That night, as Jonas was drying dishes, Mason walked into the kitchen. He held something in his hand, a photograph of his mother. I want to put this somewhere, he said. Jonas turned slowly. Of course, where Mason pointed to the mantel. Here, next to the crane, Jonas swallowed hard. She'd like that. Mason stood beside him. Do you remember how she laughed when I put peanut butter in your boots? Jonas chuckled. I do. She didn't even punish you, just told me I should have checked my shoes before stepping in. They both laughed softly. Then Mason looked up. I still hear her voice sometimes. Not like a ghost. Just a memory. Jonas put an arm around him. That's not something to be scared of. That's something to hold on to. Later, Jonas told Elise what had happened. She listened, smiling. It's not about fixing. It's about opening the door. He looked at her. You've opened a lot of doors in this house, and you've made sure we had somewhere safe to walk through. On Sunday morning, the church bells rang over the hills. They weren't regular churchgoers, but that day, Elise asked if they could go. Jonas said yes without hesitation. They walked together. Jonas, Elise, Mason, Hazel, and Wren into the small chapel that smelled of wood polish and winter coats. The townspeople turned gently to look not out of judgment, but recognition. In the second pew, Mason reached for Jonas's hand and held it. The sermon was about seasons, about how no winter lasts forever, about the beauty of waiting, about how even silence carries a kind of music, if you know how to listen. Elise didn't cry, but she closed her eyes and let the words settle in her bones. That night, back at the farmhouse, the children fell asleep early. Jonas found Elise in the kitchen, folding towels by the firelight. "I keep thinking," he said softly, "about what you said, about being heard." She looked up. "I think I've spent years trying to make noise loud enough to drown the silence. But what I really needed was someone to sit with me in it." Elise crossed the room. "I'm here," she said. "In the quiet, in the noise. In whatever comes next." Jonas touched her cheek. "Then I think we'll be just fine." Outside, the last icicles fell from the porch roof, and inside not a sound was wasted, not even silence. Spring arrived not with a fanfare, but with a whisper. Slow, patient, and tender. The snow melted into the thirsty earth. The wind softened. Green crept quietly back into the hills, like a shy guest returning home. Birds returned, chirping from fences and wires, waking the farmhouse each morning with a song that hadn't been heard in months. Jonas stood on the porch one morning, coffee in hand, watching Wren and Hazel chase bubbles across the yard. Their laughter floated through the air like it belonged in a better world. One he now believed he lived in, inside. Elise was preparing a basket, blanket, sandwiches, a thermos of tea. Today was the day they were going to Rock Ridge Pond. It had taken weeks of planning. The landowner, an old friend of Jonas's late wife, had offered the use of the small clearing by the water without hesitation. "Your people are good people," she'd said. The pond could use a little kindness. As they loaded the truck, Jonas felt a shift inside him, one part closure, one part becoming. The urn rested quietly in Elise's lap as she sat in the passenger seat, hands folded expression. Calm. Mason sat in the back with the twins who had insisted on wearing matching yellow rain boots, even though no rain was expected. "It's not goodbye," Hazel had said that morning. "It's a thank you." The pond was still surrounded by budding trees and the first hints of wildflowers pushing up through the thawed soil. A gentle breeze stirred the surface, rippling the reflections of the family as they stepped out into the sunlit clearing. They laid out a blanket. Wren passed around sandwiches. Hazel placed a paper crane by the base of an old oak tree. Jonas stood silently beside Elise. "You ready?" he asked gently. She didn't speak, just nodded. Together, they walked to the water's edge. Elise knelt and opened the urn, her fingers trembling only slightly. Mason joined them without a word, slipping his hand into his father's wren, and Hazel watched their eyes round with something more than understanding, something close to reverence. Elise spoke, her voice soft but steady. "This is where you wanted to be, where you were happy, where you knew we could come back and bring something new with us." She tipped the urn. The ashes scattered gently into the breeze, falling like dust made of memory and forgiveness. They kissed the pond's surface, disappearing into the water without a ripple. Jonas closed his eyes. Mason leaned into him. Hazel took Wren's hand. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Elise whispered, "Thank you for giving me a new way to begin." They lingered by the pond that afternoon, sharing stories, some whispered, some with laughter. Mason told the twins about his mom's hummingbird tattoo and how she used to sing while washing dishes. Elise shared how she had met her husband at a gas station and fallen for the way he laughed with his shoulders. They didn't cry. Not much, just enough. When it was time to leave, Hazel stopped and picked a wild daisy. "For the house," she said. "For the table," Wren added. Back at the farmhouse, as dusk settled in, Jonas and Elise found themselves on the porch swing. The kids were inside drawing pictures of trees and fish and stars. Jonas rocked them gently, the chain creaking in time with the spring breeze. "I never imagined life would look like this," he said. "Me neither," Elise replied. "But I'm glad it does." She turned toward him. "Me too." A pause, then Elise reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded note. "I wrote this the day you found us. I wasn't sure I'd ever give it to you." She handed it to him. Jonas unfolded the worn paper. "If you're reading this, thank you for seeing me when no one else did. Thank you for letting me stay, even when I couldn't say a word. If kindness is a home, you gave it an address." He folded the note again carefully like it was sacred. "I didn't know what I was doing that day." He said, "You didn't need to. You just needed to open the door." Jonas looked at her, then kissed her softly, gently, like he was finally brave enough to let go of the past and reach for what was already his. That night, after the children were asleep and the fire was dying low, Jonas stepped into the hallway and found 5 paper cranes on the mantel. The one in the center had a new word written on its wing. He turned toward Elise, who was waiting with her hand, extended her eyes, steady. He took it. Together, they walked toward the spare room, the room that was no longer spare. It was just theirs. In the quiet glow of lamplight in a house that had seen loss and healing in equal measure. Love didn't declare itself in grand speeches. It just stayed. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours, we'd love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what part of this story stayed with you the most? And if you'd like more stories filled with kindness, second chances and hope that arrives when you least expect, feel free to subscribe. We'd be honored to have you with us. Thank you truly for spending your time with us today. We hope this story brought a little more warmth to your day, just like it did to ours.